So I've been given the task of explaining God's heart for the nations from Genesis to Revelation in 4 6-minute sessions. So my job is to teach the whole Bible in 24 minutes. So buckle up, here we go. In the Bible, God's intention to make himself known in peoples and in nations throughout the world does not begin in the Great Commission in Matthew 28. It begins at creation. In Genesis 1, God creates humanity to reflect his glory. Adam and Eve were to be God's image bearers. And then they're commissioned by God to do two things. Listen to Genesis 1:28. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So number one, take dominion over the whole world. And then number two, populate that world with other image bearers. So subdue and then multiply. That's the creation project. So what's God's purpose for creation? What's the goal? Well, God's end game for creation is a world brimming with people who love him and worship him and reflect his character and his righteous rule. A world brimming with people who image him rightly. Or as the prophet Habakkuk says, God intends for the earth to be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. That's the point of creation. A global people of God, imaging God rightly for the glory of God. But Adam and Eve don't make good on that plan. They rebel. They want the world to revolve around them, not God. They follow the serpent's temptations. But when Adam and Eve sin, God's purpose for creation doesn't change. He doesn't wipe the universe clean and start again. He doesn't give up on the creation project. God will have a world covered with people who reflect his character and worship him rightly. God will accomplish this. And the arrival of sin doesn't change where creation is headed. It just reroutes the path to getting there. So on account of their sin, God judges Adam and Eve. But in Genesis 3:15, in the midst of judgment, God promises to raise up from Eve's line a seed of the woman who will vanquish the serpent who tempted them to sin. This seed of the woman is going to crush the serpent's head. And that seed of the woman promise has embedded into it global expectations. Right? That promise in the context of Genesis is that this seed is going to do what Adam failed to do. He will defeat the serpent. He will restore what Adam lost. He will achieve what Adam failed to achieve. This seed of the woman, this new Adam, will accomplish God's purpose for creation. He will defeat the serpent. He will restore Eden. He will even create men and women around the world who worship God and image him rightly and live in the presence of God. And so we find God advancing this plan to restore creation throughout Genesis. But he puts some rocket boosters on the whole thing in Genesis 12 when he calls this moon worshiper named Abraham to follow him. And in a Genesis 3 world defined by the curse, God promises to bless Abraham. And more than that, to bless all the families of the earth through Abraham and his seed. So God's going to accomplish his global mission through Abraham and through his children. Through this man and his family, God is going to bring the nations and the families of the earth back to himself. And over the next 400 years, Abraham's seed begins to flourish into a nation. They even begin to bless other nations like the nation of Egypt. through godly, righteous children of Abraham like Joseph. And when Egypt turns on Israel and enslaves them, God redeems Israel from slavery, not just for their sake, but for the sake of all the nations. Listen to Exodus 19:5. After rescuing Israel from Egypt, God makes them into a nation and tells them, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Israel is a kingdom of priests. This means God intends for them to mediate the blessing of God to the nations. And notice, they do that by consecrating themselves, keeping themselves holy to the Lord, and obeying his voice, and keeping his covenant. In other words, as they image God rightly, like a new Adam, God shows his character and glory to the nations and will bless them through Israel. Israel will be a light to the Gentiles. Now, Israel is at its best in all of this in the reigns of King David and King Solomon. 2 Samuel 7, God makes clear that all the promises that he gave to Abraham are going to come to be realized through David and through the line of kings that's going to come from him. David the king will represent Israel. David's righteous rule will bless the nations. David himself gets this. 2 Samuel 7:19. David hears all the promises of the Davidic covenant, and David himself recognizes that in these promises, God intends to bless all mankind through his reign, not just Israel. And then we begin to see all of this happen in the reign of King Solomon. Listen to 2 Kings 4:34. "And people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom." So Israel, now represented by her king, is a light to the nations. The nations are streaming to Zion to be enlightened by the King of Israel. Even as Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem, God's intention to bless the nations through Israel is in view. And Solomon says that the temple will be a place where even foreigners and Gentiles will call on the name of the Lord. 1 Kings 8:43, Solomon says, "The temple exists so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you." And then Solomon dedicates the temple, and he does so not just for Israel's sake, but 1 Kings 8:60, "But so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God, there is no other." So Israel, its king, its temple, it's a light to the nations. God's heart for the nations, his desire to see all peoples around the globe know him, is coming to fruition. The creation project is being fulfilled. The question is, will Israel and her kings continue to rightly image God? Will they make him known among the peoples? Will they continue to mediate God's blessing to the nations? Or like Adam, will they fail? That's what we'll talk about next time.